Hi everyone, I hope you're all doing well this week. Hopefully you got my email that I sent out, I believe yesterday, which was a Monday night, giving you a little bit of feedback on those participation points assignments. So I tried to be more detailed in the email, so I'm not going to give you some feedback in this video. If you want that, be sure to go back through your emails. In this video, obviously, I'm going to be talking about invitational rhetoric. That's what it says right here. And what I'm going to try to do is I'll answer some of your research or your reading questions, but I'll also give you a little bit more context as to why they chose to do this and just give you a little more information to hopefully help you if any of you choose to use this for your paper that's due next week. All right. So let's go ahead, and today the goals are going to be, I'll be defining invitational rhetoric, and then what we're going to do is we're going to look at some communicative options of performing it, and then finally we'll look at some external conditions that have to happen in order for invitational rhetoric to truly function properly. All right, so let's go ahead and get started. Before I actually get into defining invitational rhetoric, a little bit of background, and they give this background in the first couple of pages of the reading. So Foss and Griffin decided to create invitational rhetoric as a response to sort of the patriarchal rhetorical system that they found when they went to conferences. So a lot of times they would go to like a rhetoric conference, and it would be all men on the panel, right? And although they're not specific about this, all white men typically. So that's something that seemed to affect the way that conversations were happening, right? And so they sort of thought that if we only have one group of people controlling what rhetoric is, and if you look at the rhetoric that you study in most of your other classes, you'll see that most of the time we're relying on white men to tell us what rhetoric is. Foss and Griffin believed that there could be other types of rhetoric, and so they decided that they would create something known as invitational rhetoric as sort of a suggestion on another type of rhetoric. So this isn't like, it's not necessarily that one type of rhetoric is better than another, but you might think about it as depending on context, right? Depending on the person and their identity, they might choose invitational rhetoric over sort of the formal or normative rhetoric that we're used to. It's also important to note that, I mean, this isn't really discussed in this reading, but something that's sort of missing here is because it's created by white women, there's a few things that maybe towards the end of our discussion I'll get into as far as like some critiques of from queer individuals and people of color about invitational rhetoric. So I'll get to that. But first, let's start by trying to lay out a definition. So many of you got this right on your reading questions. So key words that are really important here are like equality, right? So invitational rhetoric is a type of rhetoric that thinks of everyone involved in rhetoric as equal, right? They and if they aren't equal, they seek to create sort of a level playing field. Invitational rhetoric is something where you want to engage with people who are different than you, and you're going to work towards that engagement in whatever way you can. So let's see, the proper definition, so they give you a bunch of different ones, but those of you who are like, where in the text are they telling me this definition? You might have missed it, but there's a heading that says definition, and it clearly says invitational rhetoric is an invitation to understanding as a means to create a relationship rooted in equality, immanent value, and self-determination. Equality, immanent value, and self-determination are three words that are really important here. Most of us know what equality is or what we expect it to be. Immanent value relates to the value that each person has in their perspective. So in other words, when you come to the table, we already imagine that you are valuable, no matter what you have to say. Okay, and then self-determination is being allowed to engage however you want in dialogue. So this might mean the freedom to say, yes, actually, I agree, I have changed my mind, or the freedom to say, no, I still disagree, but I appreciate that, like, I've heard your perspective, right? Your perspective is still valuable, we just don't agree. Self-determination, I think, is especially important in invitational rhetoric because it's different from most other types of rhetoric we talk about. It's definitely saying that persuasion is not something that is the goal of invitational rhetoric. See, persuasion can happen for sure. It's not like, okay, never persuade if you're being invitational, but it's something that you aren't always looking for, right? And you're giving people the respect to say, I trust that you can make the right decision. I will not force you to agree with me. And that is the self-determination, right? They are able to do things for themselves. You don't need to force yourself on them. So those are some really important things that you need to know about the definition of invitational rhetoric. Remember, equality, imminent value, and self-determination all are keywords that, if you were to define this, are really important in the definition. And if you are describing this, don't forget that it's important to describe the context about why they created invitational rhetoric and why they felt like it was useful for them and for other women who were involved in rhetoric. Okay, so let's go ahead and move forward. And let's talk about reading questions number 2 and 3. So what this article does is, after defining invitational rhetoric, they recognize that because it's not something that most rhetoricians have really thought about, they're going to need to present ways of doing this. So, and they're also going to need to describe like how things are going to function. And so one way that they do this is they talk about communicative options. All right, and that's something that I think the heading was sort of hard to see because it's at the very top of one of the pages. So this is on page 30 on like the right half. At the very top, you can see communicative options. I know that this is like sort of an awkward phrasing. I've chosen this because it's their phrasing, but think about this as just ways that you can do invitational rhetoric. Okay, so really what they're talking about here, at least in the first half, is the ways that you can offer perspectives, right? So they also talk about external conditions as far as communicative options, but these external conditions we'll get into a little bit more in just a second. So let's focus here on offering perspectives. So yes, like on a superficial level, this just means allowing different people to speak, right? But that description is very superficial, and it doesn't really get it, like the work that it takes to get people to speak, or the work that it takes to get other people to hear these other people. So yes, of course, the first thing that you could do in like a classroom is try to call on as many people as possible. But another thing that you could try to do is, if you are, like for example, if you have a lot of power, like you win an award, I think they talk about this in the text. If you win an award, instead of giving your speech, you could allow someone who deserves to have their voice heard give a speech for you. Or, you know, maybe you don't want to go that far. When you give your speech, you could give a shout out to people who you think are important and people who other people should hear from. So shout outs are a good way of doing this. Another interesting way that I think is something that is less explored, this is discussed on page 31 on the right side. They talk about a concept known as resourcement. Resourcement is a way of engaging with, it's sort of an unexpected way of engaging with someone. So think about it as someone comes to you, and maybe they come to you very angry or very sad, or just clearly in a way that like you probably wouldn't be able to engage in invitational rhetoric. What resourcement asks you to do is to use that source that they just gave you and shift it, right? So I think anger is one that works really well here. So they come at you with a lot of anger, and instead of replying to them with anger, you might reply to them by asking them a question, right? You might reply to them just in sort of a maybe not an overly nice way, right? But just in a way that was not angry. That's a good example of resourcement. And what they're suggesting happens is through that resourcement, you sort of push the other person into being invitational, right? Although the word push doesn't sound very invitational, but the idea here is you're like inviting them into this less angry way of communicating. One of the examples they give in the text is women who were protesting in a prison, and they were protesting violent guards. And instead of like being violent to the guards, what the women did was they sat on the ground and they just started singing. And according to the text, this sort of like threw the prison guards off guard because this wasn't really what they expected, right? I mean, of course, resourcement is not always the best option, and it's not always going to work, right? Perhaps in another case, the prison guards could have kept doing the thing that they're doing, right? Sometimes people will read resourcement as being passive aggressive. So you really have to sort of read into the situation. But I like exploring the concept of resourcement because it recognizes that not everyone goes into these conversations in an invitational way, right? Like all the other ways of offering perspective, like giving shout outs, asking people to speak, getting them to come up to take your award for you. Those things are sort of expecting that the people in the audience are already invitational, and that might not always be the case. Okay, so hopefully, as far as communicative options go, the part of offering perspectives is pretty clear. The other thing that they talk about within this section is the external conditions that must be necessary for us to be able to offer perspectives. So this is sort of what I was talking about before when I said not everyone is approaching a situation in an invitational way, right? So here's where the external conditions come in. And for those of you who missed it, this is on page 32 of the text, and they talk about a couple of different ones. So a lot of you use like safety, value, freedom, and this relates a lot to the definition that we just talked about, especially when we talk about value. So what that means is the value of like the imminent value of anyone who's going to engage, right? Freedom, this relates to self-determination. So the freedom to be able to make the choice that you want to make rather than me pushing that choice onto you. Safety, this one is not in the definition that I talked about before, but it is one of the keys to the external conditions. So when we're talking about safety, we're talking about people feeling comfortable to engage. So what's important here, and this is sort of controversial because this idea of safety, it really is dependent on who you are, right? And so when some people say safety means like you're always going to be comfortable and fine, but other people believe safety is like if you step outside of your box, if you are uncomfortable, you still feel safe because the people around you are making you feel okay to be brave enough to step outside of your box, right? So they're not super clear about which way they stand here, but just know that safety is one of those external conditions that they think needs to exist. And I would say they're probably closer to the side where you need to feel brave, right? You shouldn't be comfortable. Because invitational rhetoric isn't just about like being easy and super nice and being open-minded. It's also about making sure that you're hearing like the tough stuff that maybe you wouldn't hear, it wouldn't be able to listen to in sort of a forceful, normal rhetorical situation. They also talk about absolute listening in the reading in the external conditions section. So some of you have probably heard about this as active listening. Think about this as like not, you probably heard this, but like not planning what you're going to say while the other person is speaking, but actually like listening and listening to try to understand, right? You may not understand, but you're attempting to understand. So that's something else that they bring up. And of course, like things like respect are all really important when we're talking about invitational rhetoric. Okay, so those are the external conditions. They sort of wrap things up by telling us like what this could mean for rhetoric, right? So they see this as sort of an opening up. They see this as a way to allow for more people to be involved, to allow for people of women and people of color to feel more comfortable in rhetoric. And they also feel like not only is this important for like people to like go to the conferences and feel more comfortable, but it also means that like we can start opening up invitational or we could start opening up rhetorical theories on a whole other level. And what's important about that is like they sort of end by being invitational. So they're sort of like, okay, now that we've said this, we're hoping that there are more people who add on to what we have to say and what other rhetoricians have to say. And what's interesting is that there has been a couple of people who have responded pretty critically of invitational rhetoric, of this particular text and this sort of idea. And a lot of that has to do with, as I said before, queer people and people of color who criticize things like the idea of safety, right? Because for some queer individuals or people of color, and women as well, men as well, there's no situation where you're going to feel safe, right? So this whole idea of safety is maybe a little bit too extreme, and perhaps we shouldn't always feel safe, right? We shouldn't have to feel safe in order to engage. So that's something that people criticize them for. Some people also, there's a really great article called The Uncivil Tongue by Dana Cloud, and the last name is, I think it's Nino Rosano. And they write about how it seems like invitational rhetoric is sort of tone policing how we engage in conversations. And of course, that's really problematic because you know, one person's idea of respect or being civil might be different from another person's idea. And so I see this article as maybe not the end all be all, but a really good jumping off point for other ways of exploring rhetoric that have much less to do with persuasion and much less to do with being forceful and much more to do with like trying to actually engage with other people and trying to make an effort to understand, right? And sometimes make change, right? But again, change, persuasion does not have to be the goal. All right, so hopefully this has helped you a little bit. And as always, I'm happy to answer any questions, but when you're writing your paper, it's important that you define, if you choose invitational rhetoric to write about, it's important that you define invitational rhetoric, that you focus on some of those, the communicative options. And if you do that and you want to be more specific, you could also talk about the external conditions that are necessary for invitational rhetoric. Those are things that you could use and then apply to things that are going on in the world. Okay. All right. So as always, if you have questions, let me know, and thanks for watching.